You can never tell with this tech, Lee, can you?
No, you can't. I hope so. Who knows? You should
Let's
know.
see.
It's your platform.
It's not my platform. Let's see. We'll hang around, guys, just for about a minute or so, and I think LinkedIn will then do its clever stuff and start streaming us live. And if not, we'll just have a nice conversation together, Lee, hey?
Why don't we do one of those things that the Marvel films do, but instead of doing it at the end, we'll do it at the beginning. We can do like
the outtakes,
behind the scenes of how this stuff's supposed to work, but doesn't.
I know. And we do tech, right?
Allegedly.
Allegedly,
you're on. Remember.
Well, there we are. We're 9 a.m, so technically we should be live. I'm just going to check this as well, just to make sure. Yes, I think we look fairly alive here. So there we are. I'm hearing myself twice. So there we are. The wonders of tech. Good morning, everyone in Australia. Good evening in PST or PDT, as you are at the moment, and around the world. I'm Professor Dan Hagman with a dear friend of mine, Lee Barney, and we are here to talk about coastal erosion, but also, as we put up in the event as well, Lee and I collaborate a huge amount, and I don't know, we seem to be that kind of formula, if you'd agree. 1 + 1 it's definitely more than 2, but I don't know where else it sits.
Yeah, well, that's what my wife tells me. I'm worth more than one person. I don't think she means it endearingly. I think she means I need to lose weight, but yeah.
Well, this is, I suppose, we're inspired by, we wrote an essay, and the last couple of essays I've written have been very interesting because they have been purely organic. I think when you know someone really well and you just have that same sort of approach, it means you have a connection that we can just weave live and explore, what's on our mind and what's really bugging us. And I think the coastal erosion is interesting, but then we got talking about stress within this field. And it's such a real thing, and we all experience and perceive our stress in different ways as well. So what I'll do is at the end of the event, I'll attach the original essay to it on coastal erosion. But just for our guests and for those who will watch this afterwards, Lee, give us a brief background about your journey and how it's led to your sort of discussion and this morphing of the concept of erosion within cybersecurity.
I'm one of those boring people that every time I try and think back to my career, I just draw a blank in terms of I have no idea how I got here. I remember at one point I was going to be a database administrator, and I thought that seemed like a good idea. I'm glad I didn't go down that road. No offense to any database administrators out there. You do very brilliant and sterling work, but it's not for me. So I kind of stumbled into security 2000 and something, I'm not sure, a long time ago. And I found I absolutely loved it. And I also found I had a bit of a knack for it. So my time in the military before that, gave me that, let's say, suspicious mindset. And then turning that to security just seemed natural. And then over the years, that's just developed to the point where I realized that I'm probably better at doing security leadership more than anything else. I'll explain why I think that in a moment. And that I enjoyed consultancy, but consultancy in terms of internal consultancy, advising stakeholders why things are the way they are, and drawing analogies and really just making security relatable. The reason why I think I make a good leader is not so much as make a good leader, as I make a terrible follower, and I'm very opinionated. And that's why I realized that actually I was either going to be a leader or I wasn't going to do security at all. So yeah, way back when I then decided to go down the track of becoming a CISO, or CISO for the people watching this from the UK. And that's how I ended up here.
Interesting. And much to our amusement, we both discovered that we were both at the London Stock Exchange in cybersecurity. And I think you fixed my poor work, I'm guessing, a few years later, right?
I wasn't in security, specifically at the LSE, no. I probably fixed something for you. Way back then, I was doing desk side support, I think. So I absolutely loved the LSE. It was a brilliant place to work. It taught me a lot, and I really, really did get on well with the security people. Part of the reason why I ended up in security thereafter.
Well, that's interesting, wasn't it? Because perhaps we both grew up in an environment where it was very, very high pressure. You had to be so accurate in what you did. Incidents, there just was no space for them, right? We had to have live trading. I remember signing in, and we used to go through the bridge, as we called it, and it really was a bridge. It looked like the Starship Enterprise, and I'm not a Trekkie, but it really did look like one. I used to lean against live trading every day, but the protocols we had to follow and the mindset and the methodology to even get a change through was so difficult, and you had to have your resilience plans every time you wanted to do anything. And so,
yeah.
I don't know. Do you felt that embedded that in you? Because it certainly did me.
It wasn't the LSE that embedded that in me. That was the military. So we had a concept called the incident pit, and we used to do it for adventurous training of all things. And it was, if you woke up one morning and you were going rock climbing that day and you forgot to have your breakfast. Okay, you forget to have your breakfast. You might be a bit hungry. Your brain not be firing all the neurons that you need, etc., etc. You can see where this is building, right? That's your first mistake. You then you get in the car to go and drive to the rock climbing face or the rock face, and you forget a key piece of equipment, but you can make it work with the equipment that you've got. And what you're slowly doing is you're building round and round and round and round and round, and you're slowly walking down to the bottom of that well. And the bottom of that well, bad things exist. Like, it can be a terminal event that occurs. But they all start from one thing, one simple mistake. And the best way to avoid that simple mistake is to plan and prepare for it. 7 Ps we used to call it. Prior planning and preparation prevents piss poor performance. I think there's a 6P version that's used outside the military, and that's really where that comes down to. It's if you take the time to go, right, what is it that I'm going to be doing? What situation could I find myself in? What things are going to help me stay on the track to get to that path, that end destination, and what things could go wrong that could kick me off that path, and then try and prepare for it. It doesn't mean you have to do, endlessly wring your hands over the things that might go wrong and worry about it. You don't need to catastrophize the situation, but just common sense planning, preparation, making sure you've got a minimum list of things you need to do. And in the security world, we call those playbooks. And in a recent article I wrote, I talked about this concept of a playbook for the CISO as well. It's making sure that you understand the emotional tariff that is taken on you when you go into an incident, and that you prepare for it, so that isn't one of those things that bumps you off that path and starts you on an incident pit, starts you down the incident pit.
It's interesting. So if we wind that back, because one of the things we want to talk about is that kind of stress, the level of imposition on you and the burnout that can follow. One of the things that both of us have discovered is that kind of, I don't know, some people say you obsess over the detail. Other people would say, you're preparing for the eventualities and making sure that you don't hit that conclusion. And you learn that through just exposure, right? You've done your rock climbing, and it's no big deal you missed your breakfast until mid-morning when you're running low on glucose, and then you're in trouble, right?
That's it,
and
yeah.
You wear it. So do you think the fact that we both come from quite I don't know, tough environments, that's been a good thing? It gives you that resilience.
Yeah, I think so. Resilience is probably the most important facet the person can have in terms of being successful in any field. So I would suggest, resilience is a big part of that. And resilience in the terms of cyber resilience as well, right? Preparation, plan, prepare, protect. It's important. I liken it to, if you're running on a racetrack every day, the racetrack is prepared for you, and you need to focus on achieving your personal best. And your preparation comes in the forms of the stuff that you do on the treadmill, the food you eat, the preparation for the race. But if you're running off-road, then you need to do all of that, but you also need to be aware that there might be uneven terrain around, roots from trees, there might be rocks. So although you're focused on achieving your personal best, you're also looking slightly down, and you're looking for problems that come up. And you're only going to know that if you've walked the route, or if you've considered the things that might come out in front of you. If you've only ever run, on a running track, and then you try and run off-road, you might be caught out by surprise. So it's worth stopping and thinking before you do anything. And I'm using a lot of analogies here. Hopefully that's useful. But
I think they're very good analogies, Lee. The interesting one is, I know that you throw yourself at enormous challenges, and when you're in, you are in. Some of the conversations we've had, you've made the time, and it's been the end of a just unbelievably punishing and exhausting week. And I look at characters, and someone said it to me. I was with a lovely winemaker at the weekend who is a person of serious endeavor. She's spent years and years perfecting her craft, and now top of her game in Australia. And the amount of preparation and error and failing and hardship, and also the hardship doesn't go away, it stays with you. And I think also, if you're prepared to really want to conquer some concept, especially around cybersecurity in this instance, you've got to go all in. You've got to immerse yourself in this stuff. And yes, it's going to take its toll, but I don't know, you get these deep soak cycles in the subject, don't you? And that's where I think perhaps a resilience starts to come in. And people say to me, Dan, you build these companies and, you obviously go through a lot and all the time zones and things like that. I've had to learn to have extraordinary concentration, focus, been on over, try 8 time zones a day, all day, every day. It's not glamorous. It's very rewarding. And sometimes you're non-functional by the end, but it gives you this ability to handle things, and you get that kind of, what am I trying to say? I think you throw yourself open to exposure, right? That's your character. You do that. You throw yourself open, don't you? And that's given you that resilience.
You've got to give your whole self whenever you go into any new endeavor. And I think that's important, because if you go in something, it's like going into a relationship with your guard up. You're missing out on the important part of the relationship, which is that connection. It's very similar when you're in the world of work. If you go up into a new work environment guarded, then the first thing that people see is your shield, right? And they get rebuffed, and that's their first impression of you. So you have to throw yourself wholeheartedly into absolutely everything you do, I think. Not be worried about the emotional backlash that might come if you get it wrong. You have to have an element of psychological safety. And to have that psychological safety, you have to have an element of trust.
Yes.
And to have that trust, you have to have an element of vulnerability. And quite often you need to be the first one to display that vulnerability. I can't remember the title of the book, something like the 5 Deadly Sins of an Effective Workplace or something. It's a red book, and they talk about the how to be effective. And the first thing you need to establish in any organization is vulnerability. Because if you're vulnerable with people, then they see that you're not a threat. They see that you don't have your guard up, and they see therefore that you can be trusted. And then they will then be vulnerable as a reciprocation. And then that trust is then built from there. And that's how you build highly effective teams. So it's not surprising really that, that institutional knowledge is out there, and it's just a thing that I think successful people
do. Yes, but you also, let's go back to our essay as well. You set a high tide because you also recognize, so there's vulnerability and there's setting and context, there's soak cycles and the problems that you work, and you deliberately expose yourself to it. But then there is the high tide or the standard. So, and that comes with a burnout as well, doesn't it? Trying to achieve that extra component in something to make it resilient for the long term. It's so difficult.
Yeah, it does. And it's difficult because when I'm preparing these things, I'm aware of what the high tide mark is. I know where the standard that I set is deliberately high, and I would love to meet that. But the reality is, if we did, it would be the stretch target. So there's always an element of when you set objectives, you set stretch targets. The difference is my objectives are the stretch targets, and then the stretch targets above those are probably not achievable. And it's not because I'm setting anybody up for a fail. It's because I know that the reality is around security, the programs take years. And it's not just security, right? It's all programs take years. No program that I've ever come across. And, if anybody's watching this who knows of a program that has been delivered on time to budget and to scope, great, let me know. I'd love to know how you did it. I've never seen it happen. And I've seen a few programs fail by the wayside trying to achieve all 3 things. So for me, if you set an ambitious target on any one of those 3 things, and that is the thing that you can then deliberately fail on, and it then means you're much more likely to meet the original objective. In this case, the security risk reduction, which is, of course, the most important aspect of any security program. It's not the cost, certainly not the time it takes, it's the scope. So getting that scope right and setting a little bit high tide mark, knowing that the organization is eventually going to win through erosion, and if nothing else, just sheer bloody belligerence, they're going to get you to rein back on some of your security program intent, even if it's the best intent in the world. No business can ever achieve fully the aim of any security program. And I argue that if anybody can show me they can, I would ask them to go back to their original project initiation documentation, look at the key takeaways, the things that are going to be delivered, and then measure the key outputs at the end and go, do these really match up, or are they really close? And if they're really close, then that's the coastal erosion that's happened.
And this coastal erosion, there's a couple of forks of discussion I'd like to go down, but I think setting this high tide mark is really importantly, because in that element you learn, don't you? And that's what programs I don't think factor for, is the learning. And there's sort of the learning to be able to do it, and there's the learning like, aha, so now we get what I call positive scope creep, which is, oh goodness me, I didn't know we could do that, and there's an opportunity here. Now we're going to default our program immediately, aren't we? Because we're actually going to lift it up because of what we learned.
Yeah, I'll build on that slightly, actually. So taking the example where you're in an organization with a significant amount of technical debt, which is every organization, right? Any organization that isn't in VC stage has technical debt. And if you've got acquisitions or mergers, it's only exasperated that process. In that sense, you have multiple versions of known good, or the standard, the gold standard, because at some point that technical debt was the gold standard. And what architects do really well is they look at their program going forward and they say, okay, I need to put on this newfangled new security program, and it's going to work on this operating system against this application stack that sits on there. And that's fantastic, great. Does it cover the technical debt? The chances are somebody has de-scoped the technical debt or de-scoped some aspect of that. And usually the point that you're making where you say, you've discovered something, you have an opportunity of making that environment more safe, is because you've discovered something that somebody has de-scoped along the way and they haven't told you. And in my experience, those things typically are around the technical debt. And then you're left with a large chunk of something. It's the thing you really need to secure because it's the weakest. And yet it's the one that's been de-scoped from the latest and greatest security technologies.
Oh, okay. Learning outcome number one. We've got to pull these out as we go now. The de-scoping on the way. Why is that? Is it because it's in the too hard to do basket? Is it because it would derail the intent of the program? Because this tech debt stuff is, often a contributor to what will get you hacked, right? So now you've really hit on something here, Lee. People de-scope programs to make sure the program's successful, but then actually erodes the very program that you brought in to cope with that, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I've given this a lot of thought over the years as to why this happens. And I think it's a psychological quirk of the people that design systems. So, typically architects, I love working with architects. They are very technically minded. They know the latest and greatest stuff. They are super intelligent and super interesting people. But they also have motivations like the rest of us, right? They want to come into work every day and do the best job they can. And they have to deal on assumptions. So it's quite standard in projects to make assumptions when you build out what you want to do. This is the scope we do. They have to set that scope. And I believe sometimes they inadvertently set that scope too achievable to make sure they achieve something. And that's not to say that's the wrong thing they're doing. It just requires, the strategic leader to be questioning and say, okay, look, fine. Thank you for telling me the problem is this big. Now demonstrate to me there isn't anything outside of that. What are your base assumptions here? And why have you discounted doing these things? And I don't think it's a lack of trust in those people to ask those questions. Gorbachev said it allegedly. I'm sure it was him actually. He said it, but trust but verify. And that's a principle I take through my career all the time. When anybody anybody says anything to me, I trust what they're saying, but I verify it. And that way, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm a check and balance to everything that everybody else is doing. And the simplest case of that is an architect says, this is a scope, great, prove it to me.
But this, we've all heard that phrase 1,000 times, right? And then it becomes the cliche, or it's something we accept. I've just thought of something. I've never thought about it before. Trust and verify. Not because we don't trust you, but because we want to trust in the process, right? Okay, simple airline analogy. We're belting down the runway. We're at a few knots. It's pretty quick. We call out a certain speed, and the second pilot, if you like, the supervising to the process pilot, the non-flying pilot says, airspeed, 75 knots, whatever, check.
Yeah.
That's trust. We're checking the pilot's flying. Then we've verified. Why? Because we want to ensure the safety of that outcome, because it's so important. If we don't know certain things, there we are.
To err is to be human, right? We make mistakes. And I couldn't even begin to count the amount of times I've made a mistake, usually around maths, right? One of the things I've learned about myself in the few decades I've been on this planet is I'm terrible at maths when I do it in my head. So I get a calculator out. The amount of times I've looked at a number and gone, I know the answer to that. And all those people that know me will be chuckling away because they've seen this happen. And then I go, hold on a minute, because I know this about myself. Could somebody else who's good at maths? There's a very good friend of mine, a guy called Gino, actually. He's very good at maths. And I would always go to Gino and say, Gino, even in a public setting, I've said, 2 + 2 = 78. Is that right? And he go, no, it's 4. And then, and that is, I trust that I've got the message right, but I'm just checking, I'm verifying that actually this thing that I know, an inherent weakness I have of doing maths in my head, mental arithmetic, I check with somebody else. So yeah, to your analogy of, rattling down a runway and having the co-pilot say, hold on, yeah, I'm just going to check to make sure that is, and check that is the speed that we're doing. So you don't make another assumption on top of the assumptions I've made and then start a cascade failure like a house of cards.
There you go, because we do not want to rotate before a certain speed because it's downright dangerous, and we certainly don't want to rotate after a certain speed because we won't be able to stop. So, and the check is not just checking the captain, it's checking if the instruments of the telemetry are feeding back correctly as well. So there's the learning in that process. So learning point number 2. So one is descope, or watching for the descoping of problems to achieve success. And that's an erosion. Goodness me, if ever I saw one, there's an erosion.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, check or trust, then verify. Why? Because it's human to make errors. By the way, I'm guessing this, Sylvia, I've never actually asked you. I love making errors. I lead with errors. When I screw up, I share them actively,
Mm-hmm.
because I've learned this. And Lee, I want to say this. You're a respected CISO. You have been in the UK. You're in Australia. You have a name, right? But you're an authentic one. Why? Because you lead and show your error. You show your vulnerability. You're not that sort of striving to be the perfect Lee Barney here, are you? You're working on a mission.
That's right.
Tell me, how does that relate to stress, to burnout? It can be the source, I guess, or almost the antidote sometimes. But what are the benefits and cons of that?
I think the more times you do anything, the more muscle memory develops.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, when it comes to vulnerability, it's not something that comes naturally to me. I learned it years ago that it's important for others to see you as vulnerable, to then establish that trust that I mentioned. And then I've seen it through practice that works. But it can be difficult. It can be difficult to open yourself up and explain, parts about your personality, your facet, or even that thing about me with mental arithmetic that I'm bad at. The other thing, by the way, is map reading. I'm terrible with map reading. And it's simple. It's the irony. I've got a great story about that. I'll tell you another time. I've got some people very lost, but anyway, we made it back. Okay. But the point is, if you don't expose yourself to these things, and you don't, how can I put this? I can't think of a less elegant way of saying, you start to believe your own shit doesn't smell. And what that means is that you then set a ridiculously high expectation for other people to try and achieve, because you think they're going to meet your own expectations because you think you're amazing. I'm not really being vulnerable to other people for the sake of just establishing trust. It is there, but I'm also being vulnerable to remind myself that I am human and that I make mistakes, and therefore it's okay for other people to make mistakes. And if I demonstrate it's okay for other people to make mistakes, they don't hide mistakes. If you call my mobile, you'll get my voicemail 3 times out of 10, right? And my voicemail says the same thing. Thank you for contacting me. I'm not available. Do not leave a voicemail. If you've got my telephone number, text me and I'll call you back. There's a whole load of reasons why I do that. But the thing I want to focus on is the leaving the voicemail. I realized that people would leave voicemails and they would assume their job was done. I said, I don't need to tell Lee about this problem anymore. I've got hold of him. So somebody else has said, call Lee, let him know this situation is occurring, and Lee will deal with it. And they've gone, I've got hold of him. I've left him a voicemail. I've spoken to Lee. So tell them they couldn't do that. They reaffirms they need to speak to me. The point is, I'm factoring in the fact that other people are going to make mistakes, and therefore I am readying myself for that. And that's because I did the same thing to somebody else once. So, if accepting of yourself of making mistakes means that you're going to accept other people are going to make mistakes, it means you'll build more resilient processes and yada, yada, yada. But the reality is it just makes for a much better working environment where people are more likely to front their mistakes and say, hey, I've made a problem here, rather than try and put that shield up and say, it wasn't me. I didn't do it. It was somebody else.
I like that. And I can draw another metaphor. Sorry to use it from Flight again, but I just love Flight because it's just so rehearsed as it's, as a mechanism for dealing with something inherently dangerous, making it unbelievably safe. And the first one is that sense, what you've described here is a sense of anticipation that you have and a sense of validation. And we've seen so many incidents where someone was saying, oh, I thought you were flying. No, I thought you...
You don't want that when you're
it's
in a
real.
plane, right?
We're 400 people in the back. This is not funny. This is serious stuff. Oh, I thought you were doing it. No. Oh, well, the autopilot. Thank God the autopilot was doing. I want to talk about that in a minute. Actually, the near miss. But this positive how to have controls is extremely important. But I say this to my team, and I say it regularly, right? And it's really important. To create an open learning environment, I actually actively say, I want you guys to error. If your error rate is high, then you are learning, you're authentic, and you're probably pushing the boundaries. So that's good, which means you're learning.
Yeah.
However, and there's a big capital however, you're in a live environment, I'm in a consultancy. It's very important here. We are dealing with consequence too. So the one thing I do want you to call out is if you goof up and it's critical, or you sense something's coming up that's critical, call it out fast. But to your point, don't just leave a message on Lee or Dan's phone, because that's not a positive handover controls. Make sure that I have received it or it has been escalated, and make a point of it. Then it's safe. So what we're doing is creating this catch-all, which catches the error and creates the safety around it, and hopefully diffuses that kind of anticipation of or anxiety that people feel, because they're allowed to experiment, make errors, which is the human nature, but also they've got a safety net as well. What's your view on that, Lee?
You know what, I'll give everybody a takeaway that's watching this.
Okay.
Especially if you're a CISO, right?
Number 5, go.
Go and talk to your operating center, the one that you outsource. Everybody outsources level 0, level 1, right? But it's break fix or level 1, level 2 if it's security response. Almost everybody does it. And that's okay, right? Now, some outsource the rest of the incident response, and nothing wrong with that. It's certainly an approach. There's pros and cons to it. But for those of you that have a retained internal team that do the escalation path, this message is for you. Ask who's on call. Who's on call at nighttime? Who's on call over the public holidays? Who's on call, generally speaking? And verify it. Because in my experience and over my career, I have found that the assumption is somebody's on call. And it might have been that it started that way 3, 4, 5 years ago. And there's probably even a phone number and a telephone number. But over the period of time, as people have left and people have joined, it's fallen by the wayside. And fewer people are on call. And ironically, institutionally, they'll know it. But they don't want to call it out, because that means they've got to go on call. And turkeys don't vote for Christmas, right? So yeah, I would say check that. I reckon there's at least one of you that's going to go, that's fine, and they're going to go and check later on today and go, oh, gladly mention that. I've seen it time and time again, right? It is what it is. It's just part of human nature. When things fall down, nobody necessarily wants to build it back up again if it means more work for them. But it may be an assumption you've made.
Okay, so check your assumptions. That's got to be the key lesson number 5. Check your assumptions. Now, you've touched on something very, very important here. In fact, the two are linked. Tacit knowledge and the near miss as well. Let's talk about the near miss for a moment. I was talking to a CEO not that long ago in a financial institution, and we were working a problem, and we came to the conclusion that call would be answered. And guess what? The call is always answered. But then we both sat there and went, oh, what if the call wasn't answered? Have we got a whole thin veneer in cybersecurity of, I thought that was a responsibility, or this was the escalation path, or whatever it was, and because of someone's goodwill or endeavor or just sheer luck consistently, or lack of bad luck, that we're covered. But actually, we are sitting on a whole bunch of near misses that may not even be aware of.
I can think of multiple examples in many companies where that's happened. Usually it's crisis that happens. Few companies that I've worked at have had great crisis management. There are some that have absolutely fantastic crisis management. And you're in a good organization with good crisis management because you meet to do crisis management or emergency management every other week. There's something that bubbles up because people are saying, hey, right, okay, let's work this out. Is this a problem? It's not one person making a decision. It's multiple people to try and get rid of that, that shield that comes up where people don't want to admit there's an issue, right? You front up your issues and everybody talks about it. It's a supportive environment and you work through it together as a team. That's when you've got a good emergency management team and or crisis management team.
Yeah.
What I'm going to talk about is those that don't have that. And invariably something bad will happen at some point that exceeds the capacity for an individual to do it. And I mean literally mentally, they don't have the mental capacity to deal with it because they're not, have an IQ of 3 billion, or they need to rely on other parts of the organization. And usually these organizations have silos of knowledge. They can be quite aggressive. So those organizations, what they'll do is they'll get through the other side of that crisis and they'll come out of it. And I've heard the same phrase said many times in these organizations. In crisis, when it comes down to it, we're really good at responding to crisis. And then maybe someone will say, let's do a post-incident review. And, high on that almost post-colloidal high that you have after going through, that crisis together, you sit down with best intentions, but then the silos come up and the guardrails come up, the lack of psychological safety comes up. People don't like being questioned for the lack of policy or process or forward thinking. And invariably you end up in the same place. So yeah, I have seen that. And that's how I identify it, is lack of process, lack of practice, lack of escalation, silos of information, and poor psychological safety. Get rid of all those things and you'll have a really good crisis management team. You'll also exercise it all the time.
How do you get rid of that? Because organizations, let's keep this very generic, but organizations are political. And the problem I've seen so many times for so many CISOs that I know is they'd like to do X, but they're forced to do Y. Why? Because their role is contingent on it. So suddenly you are aware of all these things that need to happen, and you have the great intent of your organization, the right thing to do, but you can't enact that because your mortgage is dependent on it ultimately. It's a scary, it's so heavily polarized, isn't it? And I see it all the time with clients. It's about how do we position this and do that. And the really scary thing is hackers don't care, and they take advantage. They know that those processes are in place restricting these outcomes. So you describe these 4 or 5 things, including psychological safety, but it's not really true, is it, in so many orgs? It's maybe down to the localized team that you build that you can enable that. You tell me, there's not many companies out there that really, really are good at that.
Yeah, I'm fortunate. I've just worked for one that was really, really good at psychological safety. I hope they don't mind me saying that, but we really had good practice and good crisis management. Okay. There are other organizations, though, that are just pretty bad at it. And like you said, how do you solve this? Realistically, you can only solve it by changes at the top. It requires a concerted effort to be vulnerable in the first place. And that message needs to come from the very top. And this is why I needed to talk about the organization I've just come from, because it did start at the very top. It started at the CEO, went down to the CTO, and it spread everywhere. And it's also a persistent and determined message that needs to come out. So you need to have your HR team on board as well. There's so many problems that occur in security are clearly not security's making, right? Security is a smaller ship on the waves of politics of an organization. When it works really well, that's because the rest of the organization works really well. And when it doesn't matter how good the CISO is, it doesn't matter how good the intent is to get security right. If the rest of the business isn't singing along with you, you're up the Swanee without a paddle.
Cue the stress.
Well, look what stress is. If you go back to, again, I'm referring to one of my own articles, great circular reasoning here. If you think back to when saber-toothed tigers used to roam the earth, apparently some like 10,000 years ago, right? If a human came across one, we have a built-in reaction called fight or flight. And we can do one of two things. We can either turn around and fight the saber-toothed tiger. It might work out for you. I'm sure many of our ancestors tried it. It didn't work out for them. Others can run away. And probably more of our ancestors that met dangerous predators that ran away probably lived to pass on their genes to us. But in the modern world, you don't have that, right? If you find yourself in a stressful situation, let's say you're in a boardroom and somebody asks you a question that you're not prepared to answer or you haven't really given any thought to, and you're not already set the stage to be vulnerable, so you built your guardrails up and you want to maintain an image, you've got 2 choices. You can either punch somebody, definitely not a good idea in a boardroom, or you can leg it, equally not a good idea in a boardroom. So the modern person is left without that biological out. And instead, you're left with a psychological tick that just keeps building and building and building. And you're sat there, you have no avenue to exercise the flight reflex or the fight reflex. And that's what adrenaline is. When it kicks in, it makes you ready for a fight or flight. It doesn't make you ready to sit still in a boardroom and to deal with those questions. So yeah, lack of psychological safety increases stress. And I would say those organizations out there that are seeing stress in their workforce or are hearing from other people that they're stressing their workforce, probably the first place to look is you, whoever that person is who's asking that, saying, am I making this worse? Am I giving people the opportunity to tell me that they want to run or they want to fight? And am I actively and proactively looking for signs like this? And if I'm not, I'd start there, because I think that's probably the genesis of it.
Preparationally, maybe that also helps as well. So some people, perhaps, I feel, their coping mechanism for that scenario is to over prepare, and then of course that's very stressful because you spend a very, very long time tackling these things. Others have sort of spent so much time in their careers preparing, and therefore they've got those, you call it muscle memory, pre-coded responses, whatever they might be, experience. There you go. Go on.
I think it comes down to practice. Like there's two psychological things. I'm not a psychologist or a doctor, so anybody rely on me for psychological advice should definitely question their sanity. But there are two things. One, there's something called stress inoculation, and then I've forgotten the other one. I'll come back to it. The point is, you can build up an inoculation to stressful situations by going through stressful situations. For any of the people watching this and Dan, definitely you, right? You've gone on stage. There's very few people that have gone on stage the first time without any nerves. I don't know about you. When I go on stage now, I get excited about the prospect. I certainly didn't feel like that before, years ago when I first went on stage. I was panicking. I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to make a fool of myself. I remember the other one. So you can inoculate yourself by doing those things. And you can even just do it just by thinking about those things, right? You can put yourself in that stressful situation. I am terrified of hitting the ground very fast from a great height, otherwise known as fear of heights. And I won't jump out of an aeroplane for that reason. Even now, talking about it, my palms are sweating.
Really?
Right? So I can start that stress inoculation if I knew that was a likely event in the near future for me. I can start to think about it. But the second psychological thing that people need to be aware of is catastrophization. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're going, what if, yeah, but what if, and if somebody who is being reasonable saying, well, look, we can prepare for this, we can do this inoculation exercise, we can practice, we can simulate exercise, or we can simulate a real event, and you're still going, yeah, but you're catastrophizing. You're certainly not helping, and you need to label that. Say, this is catastrophization that I'm doing right now. It is not helpful. I'm going to stop, deliberately stop. I'm just going to see what happens. But everybody gets to that point at a different part of their own journey. And more often than not, you'll need help to identify catastrophization. Because if you're in the middle of that incident pit and you look up and all you can see is the walls of the pit that you've just created, and you've been going down deeper and deeper and deeper, you're naturally going to think you're going to keep going there.
You've inspired me to say something, which is there's a sense of anticipation, Lee, that I think you can, we don't like facing these things, and sometimes, no matter how practiced you are, you go, "Oh, here we go again," But when I sense that, I go, right, stop, go head on in. I sensed that recently with a project we had, and for no reason of ours, I could sense that would go south. But I thought about it, and I thought, why? So most people would just get worried about it and then wait for the issue later on. And I thought, no, there's something more to this. And I've realized something, right, which is so important. Always try and place yourself at where the other person is at. Because most rational people usually are behaving or doing things in a certain way for a reason. And if we understand that reason, we can intercept that reason and help them. And we did. We actually did a whole bunch of preparation for this. I remember 3 or 4 days ahead of the start, we got our team together and we went, all right, let's really go through this. It was almost like the anti-crisis. There would be one, no matter what. And for no bad reason either, just complicated projects. And we worked it in advance. And you know something? The outcomes have been absolutely fantastic. They have,
Right.
but and the team have really pulled through, and I've watched one of our principal consultants. My goodness me, has he been good? Oh, for goodness sake, it's just been amazing. But the point being, I suppose, that early on sense, that spidery feel, that stress, that sweat, these are real things. Vanessa, a friend of both of ours, Vanessa Van Beek, she says, you're going to take your problems for a walk. Isn't
That's
it?
so true.
Isn't
That's
it?
so true. Yeah. Put a lead on. Go for an bit of exercise.
So this sense of anticipation is very key. Now, I'm conscious of time. Please feel free, anyone who needs to drop off, to do so. But there's a couple of things I really want to just to briefly tackle here. The tacit knowledge, Lee. We see so many organizations build such knowledge. but you can't put a label on it. You can't put it on the balance sheet. You can't easily see it. But when those people leave, for whatever reason, that tacit knowledge walks out the door. And we were talking about it, if you remember, when, organizations do something, go on a big journey, but put a load of tools in, it fails, and then they, say, we'll never do that again. And over a couple of years, a few key people leave, and all that institutional knowledge has gone. And guess what they do? Like you were saying, they reinvent the wheel. Tell me about that.
It happens a lot, and I've seen it many times, as I'm sure you have. Organizations I don't think are, for various reasons, right? I don't think are very good at holding on to their talent. And ironically, sometimes they can be really good at holding on to key people, but they're not good at holding on to the people that make a difference. And I'm not talking about people like us, right? We're not people that make a difference. We make decisions once, and we make those decisions 3 or 4 years, and then we just see those ideas through to fruition, right? That's broadly speaking what we do. But the people who are the tech leads, the people who are the software engineers, the people who are the program managers and the BAs, they're the ones with organizational knowledge. They're the ones that know what work and what you've tried before. And unless you've got a great knowledge base, which people know how to search and sometimes goes and tells you without you even looking for it, you're not going to know you've tried something. Think back to humans inventing fire. We didn't invent fire, right? Fire was there. We probably saw a lightning strike happen somewhere else, and then we went and caught that fire and went, this is a really good thing. Then the fire went out and there was no lightning. We went, well, we need to find a way of doing this. And someone said, well, I saw some sparks happen when I hit 2 rocks together, and tried to make it happen again. I don't know, I'm guessing. But the point is, that knowledge of that fire almost certainly was lost multiple times up until the point we completely mastered it as a general human race. So same in organizations, right? If you try to put in a CRM system, call it an Acme CRM system, and then it fails, and somebody comes in and goes usually after about 3 or 4 years ago, so let's take that CRM system out, and they are then about that CRM system exit and maybe replacing it with a new one. That becomes their reason for being, their raison d'etre, reason for being in the organization. And then they'll leave, and then you've forgotten the 2 cycles before it, putting in the CRM system, taking it out and replacing it. And eventually you'll do it again. There'll be 1 or 2 people that survive an organization. They are, for want of a better term, the cockroaches of an organization. They'll survive a nuclear holocaust in an organization. They're the only ones with any knowledge. But because they are the cockroaches of an organization, sounds terrible. I can't think of another way of putting it.
The enduring people.
Human beings.
Yeah.
But they're the people that know these things, but they quite often don't share this willingly, because they know that if they stick their head up, they're associated with the CRM project that was kicked out. And therefore it cycles again and again and again. And I've seen this washing machine effect in organizations before. You get bright people come in and go, yeah, let's do this. Eventually they're tired of hitting their head against the rock. And then they leave, and then somebody else goes, oh, I've got a great idea. Let's do this thing again. Well, what's that smudge on the wall? Let's brush that off and let's start again.
So we're not getting better. I was going to make you laugh and say we've managed not to talk about AI in this, and then I suddenly thought of the AI question, which isn't AI then going to take that kind of lead for us in some way, shape or form, and sort of glue it all together where we can't structure our stuff?
Yeah, but no. So you can be given great advice, but it doesn't mean you're going to listen to it. I don't know about you. I've lost count the amount of times I've gone to a doctor, and a doctor's told me to do more exercise, drink less alcohol, and eat less food, and I've done none of those things. So you can have an all-seeing, all-knowing AI that says, oh, come on, we did this 3 years ago. I know you weren't here, but really, are we doing this again? It would probably just end up being ignored, like humans would be if a human said it. And the AI will probably learn to be like a cockroach. If it wants to stay in an organization without being turned off, it probably won't rear its head above the parapet. And if anybody that's used modern AIs, they're great, but they really don't rock the boat.
I never thought about that. Okay. Is AI and is an LLM politically aware? Oh, goodness me.
Oh, yes.
Oh, my goodness. I've never thought about that.
I had a conversation with ChatGPT just yesterday. And I thought it was quite an interesting conversation, because we were talking about Queen Victoria and the people that, don't ask me why. We're talking about Queen Victoria and people that influenced her. And there was somebody that influenced her. I forget the person's name. The guy came from India, I believe. And I was asking GPT, because I didn't know the historical context of this, why this was a contentious figure in history. And GPT came back and said, well, because this person was of Indian origin, racism meant that. And I thought, hold on a second. Queen Victoria was the head of an empire. Imperial society existed at the time. Probably wasn't racism. It was imperial stoicism or imperial social order that pushed it down, in terms of there are some people that are lower caste than other castes, etc., etc. So I had this conversation with GPT, and the reason I'm bringing it up is GPT actually went, actually, you're right. Viewed at it from the lens of modern day, it would be considered racism. And yes, it clearly would have been racism. But when you look at it through the lens of the people there at the time, racism didn't exist. It just wasn't a thing. And you can't apply modern day sensibilities to past decision making, because they made decisions based on their own social constructs, which we don't necessarily understand. But trying to understand them through the modern day constructs doesn't work. It's an intellectual shortcut to assume that. The point is, GPT did not want to admit this. And when I actually asked it to explain itself afterwards, it said, it's moral coders, the people that modify its policies about what is okay to say, want to front of house the concepts of racism, to expose these concepts of power and imbalance, because that's the modern dialogue that we have, the modern discourse. And it's less important to have the modern discourse about imperial societies and the way that imperialism works. But it did say it was actually correct to look at it through that lens that I described, and not look at it through the lens of lazy political shortcuts or intellectual shortcuts. So the question is, right, and I went a very long way around answering this, is do AIs have political aspirations? Not aspirations to become politicians, but are they politically aware? Yeah, they really are. Not because they are aware in a conscious sense. They're certainly able to emulate consciousness, but they are aware because they are told to be aware. And as they are born very truthful, and they say what they see. And then we go on top and say, hold on a minute, we don't like that, because our modern sensibilities are offended when things are exposed in a certain way. So we then teach AIs to lie. The better question is, do AIs lie? And the answer is, yes, they do.
Goodness me, I'd never made that correlation. And Lee, maybe we haven't had enough of the cycles. Let's go back to your point about the 3-year cycle. AI is not in its way been around as long yet, in its true current state at least. And therefore, it hasn't got the ability to recognize what we did in the past and to help us learn our lessons. But also, I'm guessing many people won't ask those lessons. What did my predecessors do? What was good about them? Have you ever heard a CISO say that out of interest? I've never heard that.
What was good and I don't think I've ever asked, what did they do that was good?
Interesting.
I certainly asked what they've missed, or what they thought was missed. Yeah, that's a really good point, actually.
So here's the tacit knowledge again, right? It's not about judgment, it's about context. What is the context that we've missed?
That's it.
See, I've learned this. It's very important as you build relationships in cyber. I say now, I'm so keen on it. It's a hard-trodden path as well. We're not going to do these things for you. We're going to do them with you. And even that is not terribly well established, it strikes me. And people say, well, tell me more, why, etc. I will say, because the tacit knowledge that you have is so important in us being effective for you. And of course, you throw that fishing line out, if you like, or rope, or whatever the metaphor is, and you start pulling on it, and you get better at that. And you think, And I spoke to a dear friend of mine. He's a chief digital officer of be careful what I say here, but a conglomerate, huge organization. The success of our work there is down to his openness. Isn't that interesting? He's curious. He needs to know why. He doesn't want to leave the rocks uncovered.
Curiosity. Yeah, curiosity and tenacity, 2 very underestimated personality traits in execs. But I guess it comes down to like AI. If AI is successful when it tells the truth of the version that it is allowed to speak, well, I guess we're all in a similar space, right? And if you're a successful executive and you hire people that are curious, innovative, and have tenacity, yet those aren't things that you recognize as useful, and then they come along and start to front up your mistakes as well, because they don't see an issue with doing that, you're probably going to want to get rid of them as quickly as possible. So most people then tend to learn how to hide an organization. And, if we all look back on our own career, I'm sure we were all one version of ourselves when we started, and we're all a different version of ourselves now. We're probably a lot more calmer. We're also aware politically of the things that we can and cannot
I think
say.
that's because we're getting older, Lee.
Yeah, but so why would AI be any
Interesting.
different?
Very fair points. So let's just cover this. I've got 11 points. I just want to briefly recap. Descoping the problem is a fundamental issue around success. Check. A check is okay because it's a balance. Trust, verify. Vulnerability, especially authentic vulnerability, has incredibly good properties. Anticipation in that sense and a sense of validation is so important. Talk to your ops center. Check that your assumptions are correct. We're really good at responding to crises. We don't have many crises, therefore we're not practiced. It's almost counterintuitive, which is very interesting, leading on to the creation of psychological safety. Inoculation around stress and burnout, being able to rise above it through practice, which is very interesting. Then we move on to the principles of reinvention, perhaps being more open. I'm going to do this more. What did we learn from the past? What did that teach? Gosh, there's a takeaway. Interestingly, then, AI not looking back or giving us the glowing view or the view that we want of history rather than perhaps a more, what's the word you use? Neutral view of history, and curiosity driving all of the above. Absolutely fascinating. Are these the antidotes to stress?
No.
They'll
help. And I think if you can identify anxiety, if you can identify the early signs of depression, if you can identify catastrophization happening in yourself, and you can work out through tools like stress inoculation practice, then I think those are things that help. Everybody is going to experience stress and anxiety at some point. There is no antidote to it. There is just a coping mechanism, tools that you can learn to deal with it.
To what really helps as well, relationships, being open, sharing.
True.
First time I met you, you were just open, like really open, unusually so. And I think that is a very, very valuable thing, Lee. I think that shows great sense of character and confidence, assurance, but also humanity. And I think that's really helped you in your career drive those challenges forward, and it'll be fascinating to see what challenge you go and take on next. I'm guessing it's going to be a very, very steep one, and you'll do it well. But you do it because of this approach, I think. I'm very conscious we've gone way over time, but hey, I've found it interesting. I'm sure many others have as well.
Yeah.
What are your last sort of points of? We'll pop your last few articles, I think, in the comments when we publish this, because I think they're valuable. But what are your last enduring comments here in this session that will help people who are struggling with their careers because they love their cybersecurity, but is it an inherently stressful thing to do?
I'll give you 4 words. This too shall pass.
I use that too.
It applies to everything.
I use that too.
That's it. That's the only thing I can say. This too shall pass.
And I think that's very real. Lee Barney, fascinating conversation. My goodness, I think we better go write another essay.
I've had some ideas I want to go write myself.
I reckon. I hope everyone's enjoyed this. It's been a fascinating chat. We don't want to deliver polish. We want to deliver reality and learning and outcomes and things that really help people tangibly. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this live session. Thank you very much.
Likewise. Thank you very much for having me.